The pain did not arrive quietly. It came like a storm inside the body of Will Smith. A deep, burning agony that no smile, no applause, no red carpet could hide anymore. For weeks he had tried to ignore it. The dull pressure in his chest, the strange exhaustion that crept into his bones, the nights when sleep refused to come because something inside him felt terribly wrong. But when the doctors finally spoke the words, late-stage cancer, the room seemed to collapse into silence. Not the kind of silence found in empty spaces, but the heavy, suffocating silence that falls when a life suddenly stands on the edge of something unimaginable. Across from him sat his wife, Jada Pinkett Smith, her eyes fixed on the doctor's lips as if hoping the sentence would change before it reached the end. It didn't. For a long time no one spoke. Outside the hospital window, Los Angeles moved as it always did. Cars rushing through sunlight, people laughing somewhere on sidewalks, the world continuing with its careless rhythm. But inside that room, time had slowed to something fragile and uncertain. Will Smith, the man who had spent decades making millions laugh, sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of the diagnosis settling over him like an invisible shadow. Cancer. Late stage. Aggressive. Words that sounded clinical, almost ordinary. Yet each one carried the quiet threat of a future that suddenly looked terrifyingly short. Jada was the first to break. Not with a scream, not with tears at first, just a whisper. Will, her voice trembled, barely louder than the soft hum of the machines in the room. She reached for his hand, and in that small movement, there was a desperation that no cameras had ever captured before. For years, the world had seen them as a powerful couple. Strong, controversial, sometimes misunderstood, but always standing in the glare of public attention. Yet here, in the sterile white light of a hospital consultation room, none of that fame mattered. There were no interviews, no stage lights, no scripts to follow. Only a man fighting a disease that threatened to take everything away. And a woman watching the person she loved slowly enter a battle she could not fight for him. Later that evening, the pain returned with a vengeance. Will sat in the hospital bed, his shoulders tense as waves of discomfort rolled through his body. The doctors explained that the tumor had spread further than expected. Treatment would begin immediately. Aggressive therapy, endless tests, long nights under fluorescent lights. Words like survival rate floated through the conversation, carefully measured, cautiously delivered. But behind the medical language was a truth neither Will nor Jada could escape. The road ahead would be brutal. Jada stayed beside him, hour after hour. Sometimes she spoke softly, telling stories about old days, about the first time they met, about the early struggles before fame, about the moments when life felt simple and hopeful. Sometimes she said nothing at all. She would simply sit there, her fingers wrapped around his, as if the warmth of her hand might somehow anchor him against the darkness creeping into their lives. There were moments when Will tried to joke, a reflex from years of performing. "Guess the universe finally decided to give me a plot twist," he murmured once, forcing a faint smile. But the smile didn't last long, because even he could feel it, the exhaustion spreading deeper each day, the strange weakness that turned ordinary movements into heavy effort. The body that had once run through action scenes and blockbuster films was now struggling against something far more relentless than any villain he had ever played on screen. News of his illness had not yet reached the public. The world still believed everything was normal. But within the quiet walls of that hospital floor, a different reality was unfolding. Nurses walked in and out with careful steps. Monitors beeped softly beside the bed. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air. And through it all, Jada watched the man she had shared decades of life with slowly confront a fear that few people are ever truly prepared for. One night, when the hallway outside had grown silent and the city lights shimmered faintly through the glass window, Will opened his eyes and looked toward her. Jada was sitting in the chair beside the bed, her head bowed slightly, her fingers still holding his hand. For a moment, he studied her face, the strength she tried so hard to maintain, the quiet exhaustion hidden behind her calm expression. And something in that moment felt heavier than the illness itself. Because cancer was not just attacking his body. It was reaching into every corner of their lives, into the memories they had built, into the future they had imagined, and in the dim hospital room, as the machines continued their steady rhythm and the night stretched endlessly beyond the window, Jada lifted her eyes toward him, her gaze filled with a pain so deep that even words could not begin to carry it. The next morning arrived slowly, not with sunlight, but with the quiet shuffle of nurses outside the door. Inside the hospital room, Will Smith lay half awake, staring at the pale ceiling above him. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic from the medical equipment beside the bed. Every few seconds, the monitor released a soft electronic pulse. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm was steady, almost hypnotic. Yet every sound reminded him that his body was no longer moving through life freely. Now it was being measured, recorded, observed. He shifted slightly. Even that small movement carried a dull ache through his chest. On the bedside table sat a glass of water that had not been touched since the night before. Next to it, a folded pair of reading glasses. A simple hospital wristband wrapped around his arm, the thin plastic pressing gently into his skin. The letters printed on it were stark and impersonal. His name, a number, a barcode. It was strange to see his identity reduced to something so small. For decades, the world had known him as a star. Now the hospital knew him as a patient. Across the room, Jada Pinkett Smith was still there. She had fallen asleep in the chair sometime before dawn. One arm rested on the side of the bed, her hand still loosely holding his. The position looked uncomfortable, but she had not moved. Her hair fell softly over one side of her face, and the faint morning light coming through the window touched her shoulders. Will watched her quietly. The stillness of the moment felt fragile. He noticed small details he might never have paid attention to before. The faint crease in her sleeve where she had been leaning forward all night, the way her breathing rose and fell slowly as she slept, the quiet strength in the way her fingers still held his hand, even in sleep. It was in these tiny moments that the reality of everything began to settle deeper inside him. Cancer was not just a diagnosis written in a chart. It was this room, this chair, this long night where neither of them had truly rested. The door opened softly. A nurse stepped inside with careful footsteps, pushing a small metal cart. The wheels made a faint rolling sound across the floor. She checked the monitors, glanced at the chart at the foot of the bed, then adjusted one of the IV lines with practiced precision. Will felt the cold fluid enter his vein, a slow, spreading chill moving through his arm. The nurse noticed he was awake and offered a gentle smile. "Good morning." Her voice was quiet, almost respectful of the stillness in the room. Will nodded slightly. His voice came out rough. "Morning." Jada stirred at the sound. Her eyes opened slowly, disoriented for a second, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then she saw him looking at her, and the memory of everything returned instantly. She straightened in the chair. "You're awake," she said softly. It was such a simple sentence, but behind it was relief, fear, and something else too. An unspoken question she was too afraid to ask. Will tried to smile. It wasn't the confident smile the world had seen for years. It was smaller, tired, but still unmistakably his. "I guess I couldn't sleep through all that noise," he joked weakly, nodding toward the machines. Jada let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. She reached forward and gently adjusted the blanket around him. smoothing the fabric near his shoulder, the way someone does without even thinking about it. The gesture was so ordinary, so human, that for a moment the hospital room felt less like a place of illness and more like a small island of shared life. Outside the window, the city was waking up. Cars moved along distant streets. A helicopter passed somewhere far above. Morning light spread slowly across the skyline of Los Angeles. Inside the room, time felt slower. Will's eyes drifted toward the window. He could see only a slice of the sky from his bed, a narrow rectangle of pale blue framed by the hospital building across the street. It reminded him strangely of movie sets, those artificial skylines painted onto giant panels during filming. Except this was real, and his body, lying here under hospital lights, was real too. Jada noticed where he was looking. "You want the curtain open more?" she asked. He nodded slightly. She stood up and walked to the window. The curtain rings slid softly along the metal rod as she pulled it back. More light entered the room, touching the floor, the bed, the white sheets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sunlight revealed things the dim light had hidden. The faint grayness beneath Will's eyes, the exhaustion etched into Jada's expression, the quiet tension hanging in the air. But it also revealed something else, their closeness, their shared silence, the way two people can sit in the same room and feel the weight of the same unknown future. Jada returned to the chair beside the bed and sat down again. Her hand found his. Outside, the city continued moving. Inside the hospital room, the morning settled gently around them. And in that quiet space between the steady beeping of machines and the distant sounds of life beyond the window, every small detail, the glass of water, the folded blanket, the warmth of a hand held tightly, seemed to carry the fragile feeling that the world had suddenly slowed, waiting. The hours that followed did not unfold with answers. They unfolded with questions, the kind that no doctor writes in a report, the kind that sit quietly in the corners of a room. By late afternoon, the hospital corridor outside had grown quieter. Footsteps echoed occasionally against the polished floor, and the soft hum of medical equipment blended with the distant murmur of voices from other rooms. Inside, Will Smith had barely moved for nearly an hour, not because he was sleeping, but because his mind had wandered somewhere far beyond the hospital walls. The sunlight had shifted since morning. It now slanted through the window at a sharper angle, painting long, pale shapes across the floor and climbing slowly toward the bed. Dust particles drifted lazily through the light, floating in the air like tiny fragments of time itself. On the small television mounted in the corner of the room, a muted news broadcast flickered silently. Images changed. Crowds, traffic, flashing headlines, but the sound was turned down low enough that it barely existed. None of it seemed real compared to the quiet gravity inside the room. Across from the bed, Jada Pinkett Smith stood near the window. She had been there for several minutes, staring outside as if trying to memorize the view. The city looked deceptively calm from this height. Buildings glowing under afternoon light. Cars moving in steady lines. People somewhere below continuing their lives without any idea what was unfolding in this single hospital room above them. Behind her, Will shifted slightly. A small movement, but enough to draw her attention. "You need something?" she asked softly, turning toward him. For a moment he didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something across the room, something small resting on the edge of the bedside table. A folded piece of paper. The nurse had left it there earlier. Jada followed his gaze. "Is that the new report?" she asked quietly. He didn't reply immediately. The paper remained untouched. Simple, ordinary, yet somehow heavier than anything else in the room. Neither of them had opened it. Not yet. The doctors had explained that more tests were being done, more scans, more evaluations. Words like progression, response, possibility floated through the conversations earlier that day. But none of those explanations had truly settled the uncertainty pressing around them. Will finally spoke, his voice low. Did they say when they'll come back? Jada hesitated. They said later. Later? Such a small word. And yet it stretched across the room like a shadow. Another silence followed. Outside the door, a cart rolled past, the faint rattle of metal trays briefly interrupting the stillness. Somewhere farther down the hallway, a phone rang once, then stopped. Inside the room, the folded paper remained exactly where it was. Will looked at it again, then away. He leaned back against the pillow, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling once more. The pain in his body had dulled slightly since the morning, replaced by a strange heaviness that seemed to live somewhere deeper than physical discomfort. It was the feeling of waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Jada returned to the chair beside him, but she did not sit immediately. For a moment she stood beside the bed, looking at him in a way that carried too many thoughts to speak aloud. "You don't have to read it right now," she said gently. He gave a faint nod, but the uncertainty did not disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow quietly in the spaces between their words. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time inside hospital rooms often loses its shape. At one point, Will turned his head toward the window again. The sky outside had begun to soften into early evening colors. Orange and pale violet stretched across the horizon, reflecting faintly against the glass of nearby buildings. For a moment, the city looked almost peaceful. But inside the room, the atmosphere remained suspended in something unspoken. Finally, Will glanced again at the folded paper. Still untouched. Still waiting. He studied it, the way someone might look at a locked door, knowing that whatever lies behind it could change everything, yet unsure whether opening it would bring clarity or only more uncertainty. Jada noticed the tension in his expression. She reached for his hand again. Her fingers wrapped around his slowly, carefully, as if even the act of holding on carried its own fragile importance. Neither of them said what they were thinking, because sometimes the most frightening questions are the ones that have not yet been asked. The light outside continued fading. Shadows lengthened across the floor, and the folded paper on the bedside table remained exactly where it had been placed. Unopened, silent, holding within it something neither of them had yet found the courage to face. Evening arrived quietly. The hospital lights turned softer, dimmed just enough to imitate the coming night outside. The corridor beyond the door had grown almost silent now, interrupted only by the occasional footsteps of a nurse finishing a late shift. Inside the room, the shadows had stretched longer across the floor. Will Smith had not spoken for a long time. He sat half upright in the hospital bed, the white blanket gathered loosely across his lap. The monitors beside him continued their steady rhythm, soft electronic pulses marking time in a place where time itself felt strangely distorted. Beep, beep, beep. Across from him, Jada Pinkett Smith had finally moved from the chair and was standing near the window again. The glass reflected faint images from the room. The bed, the quiet equipment, the pale shape of Will resting against the pillows. Outside, the city of Los Angeles was beginning to glow. Thousands of tiny lights appearing one by one. Cars flowing along distant streets like slow rivers of red and white. From this height, the world looked peaceful, almost beautiful. No one down there could see the hospital window where two people stood, suspended between uncertainty and hope. Will turned his head slightly. Jada. His voice was softer now than it had been earlier in the day. She turned back immediately. Yes? For a moment he didn't continue. Instead, he looked toward the bedside table again. The folded paper was still there, unopened. It had become part of the room now, like the glass of water or the quiet machines. Something present, something waiting. Jada followed his gaze. Neither of them moved toward it. Instead, she walked slowly back to the bed and sat beside him, closer this time than before. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. For a moment, their shoulders nearly touched. The air between them felt calm but fragile. I remember something, Will said after a long pause. What? He looked toward the window where the last traces of sunset had faded into a deep blue sky. "The first movie premiere I ever took you to." Jada smiled faintly. "That was a long time ago." "Yeah," he murmured. "Feels like another lifetime." The room grew quiet again. But this silence was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't filled with fear or tension. It felt slower, heavier with memory. Will lifted his hand slightly, not toward the paper, toward hers. Their fingers met halfway, resting together on the blanket. Outside, somewhere far below, a car horn sounded briefly. The city continued moving with its endless energy, people laughing in restaurants, traffic lights changing colors, strangers walking beneath glowing street lamps. Up here, everything felt still. The hospital clock on the wall ticked quietly. Minutes passed, maybe more. Jada leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting toward the window again. The reflection of the room in the glass had become clearer now that night had fallen. She could see Will behind her in the reflection, his silhouette calm but distant, like someone observing his own life from far away. "Are you tired?" she asked gently. "A little." He didn't close his eyes. Instead, he continued watching the city lights. On the bedside table, the folded medical report shifted slightly as the air conditioning vent stirred the room's cool air. Just a tiny movement, the paper sliding a few millimeters across the polished surface. Neither of them reached for it. Not yet. Jada rested her head lightly against the back of the chair beside the bed. Her hand was still holding his. For a long time, nothing else happened. The machines continued their quiet rhythm. The city lights outside shimmered like distant stars, and in the dim hospital room, beneath the soft glow of the overhead lamp, Will Smith remained sitting in silence, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window, beyond the hospital, beyond the questions that still waited quietly on the table beside him.